The Veridion Briefing.
Welcome to the Veridion Briefing. I am Sloan Mercer with the Veridion Group, a private intelligence and security consultancy. This is the Global Terrorism Situation Report for the week of March 20th, 2026. This week, the global threat picture is being reshaped by war. The U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran that began on February 28th have fundamentally altered the Middle East security environment, pushing MENA to the highest threat level on our global board. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the clearest terrorism-specific signal on the planet, with Nigeria recording the single most dangerous urban surge of any city worldwide. Pakistan's border corridor is accelerating, and the rest of the map, while lower in terrorism-specific risk, continues to present operational hazards that corporate security teams and risk managers cannot afford to ignore. I am going to take you through all 8 theaters, explain what the data actually shows versus what the headlines suggest, and identify the specific cities, corridors, and countries that demand immediate attention. Before I begin, there is one analytical distinction that is more important this week than any other week we have published. It is the difference between operating environment violence and terrorism attribution. Our analytical systems measure whether a country's political violence event count is likely to exceed its own historical high-stress threshold. That tells you whether conditions are unusually dangerous relative to what that specific country normally experiences. But it does not tell you whether the violence is terrorism. Countries like Iran, Ukraine, Lebanon, and Ecuador can rank extremely high in our structural model because the operating environment is intensely stressed, even when the violence is driven by conventional warfare, proxy conflict, or criminal activity rather than terrorism. The theater-by-theater terrorism classifications I provide in this briefing tell you which category of violence is dominant. That distinction determines whether your response posture should be terrorism-focused, conflict-focused, or hybrid. With that framework in mind, let me start with the theater that leads the global board this week. The Middle East and North Africa is the #1 theater in the world right now, and it is there because all 3 of our analytical engines are moving in the same direction. The structural baseline says it is hot, the live reporting confirms it, and the historical archive supports it. That triple convergence is the strongest signal our system can produce, and MENA is the only theater generating it at this intensity. The driver is the regionalized conflict system encompassing Iran, Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. Since the U.S.-Israeli strikes began on February 28th, the theater has been operating at an intensity level that dwarfs anything in our historical data. Iran recorded 531 political violence events against a historical high-stress threshold of 3. Lebanon recorded 413 events against a threshold of 9. Those are not marginal exceedances. Iran is running at roughly 177 times its historical stress ceiling. Lebanon is running at roughly 46 times its own. The live signal layer sharpens this picture further. Our analysis shows sustained city-linked violent event persistence across Tehran, Beirut, Tel Aviv, Baghdad, and related hubs. The Tehran-Beirut Eastern Mediterranean arc represents the highest corridor-level pressure on the global board. Surge analysis identifies Tehran, Tel Aviv, Ras Laffan in Qatar, Ramat Gan, Riyadh, Baghdad, and multiple Iranian cities as showing 72-hour acceleration patterns. These are not historical trends, these are current conditions. The critical analytical caveat for MENA is attribution. The terrorism-specific classification for the theater this week is hybrid mixed environment. That means the extreme numbers reflect a combination of state-on-state conflict, proxy operations, and non-state actor terrorism blended together in a way that cannot be cleanly separated in real time. Decision-makers should prepare for all 3 manifestations simultaneously, rather than treating the threat as purely one category. We assess with high confidence that MENA will remain the lead theater over the next 7 days, with a probability of approximately 70 to 85% that the region will continue to generate the most decision-relevant threat activity. The decision support recommendation is review now, the highest action level we assign. If you have energy infrastructure exposure, maritime or port operations, or expatriate personnel anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Gulf, or the broader MENA corridor, this requires immediate posture review. The regime shift trigger state is executive escalation, the highest category on our board. We have not assigned that designation to any other theater. A specific development that illustrates the escalation trajectory is a reported drone strike on a British airbase in Cyprus using an Iranian-manufactured drone. That incident, if confirmed, represents conflict spillover from the MENA system into a NATO member state's sovereign territory. We have assigned that source a credibility rating of 3 rather than 2 because attribution complexity in drone provenance remains significant. But the incident is analytically important because it marks a potential corridor expansion beyond the current conflict footprint. Now let me turn to the theater that should concern terrorism analysts most directly. Sub-Saharan Africa is the clearest terrorism-dominant theater in the world this week. It is the only theater on our entire global board receiving the designation terrorism rather than hybrid or mixed. That means the violence we are observing in SSA is more directly attributable to identified terrorist networks than in any other region, including MENA. The picture this week is anchored by 2 developments in Nigeria that are independently corroborated by major international wire services. First, Nigerian military forces repelled a large-scale insurgent assault on a military base, an engagement significant enough to be reported by Reuters as a major operational event. Second, and more concerning, a suspected triple suicide attack in Maiduguri killed at least 23 people. These are not ambiguous signals. These are confirmed incident-grade terrorist attacks reported by the most reliable open-source outlets available. Maiduguri is the top global surge city this week. It has the highest 72-hour acceleration score of any urban area worldwide. That means the rate of increase in violent event reporting concentrated on Maiduguri is rising faster than any other city on the planet. The Borno State Corridor in northeastern Nigeria, extending into Niger, represents one of the 3 highest pressure corridors globally. Beyond Nigeria, the structural picture in SSA remains elevated across a broad belt. Burkina Faso has the highest baseline exceedance probability in the theater. Ethiopia follows closely. Cameroon, South Sudan, Mali, Niger, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo all appear on the theater hotspot roster. The breadth of this pressure belt is what makes SSA so persistently dangerous. Even if conditions improve in one country, the other nodes sustain the overall theater-level threat. The fatality dimension in SSA continues to distinguish it from other theaters, where MENA's severity is count-driven, reflecting the sheer volume of events in a massive conflict system. SSA's severity is lethality-driven. Individual events in Sub-Saharan Africa tend to produce more casualties per incident, reflecting the nature of jihadist operations. Ambushes, base assaults, suicide attacks, and raids on civilian populations. We assess with high confidence that SSA will remain the clearest terrorism-dominant theater over the next 7 days, with a probability of approximately 65 to 80% of continued jihadist pressure. The decision support recommendation is review now. If you have NGO operations, supply chain exposure, or expatriate personnel in the Sahel corridor, in Nigeria's northeast, or in East Africa, treat this as requiring immediate attention. South Asia occupies the 3rd tier of concern this week, and the signal there is accelerating. Pakistan is the driver. The country recorded 103 political violence events in the observed period against a historical threshold of 42.8, running at more than double its own worst-case norm. The proprietary baseline places Pakistan among the highest structural hotspots on the global board. But the live signal layer is where the real story emerges this week. Kabul and Islamabad both rank among the top global surge cities, with 72-hour acceleration scores ranking 3rd and 6th worldwide respectively. The Afghanistan-Pakistan corridor represents the 3rd highest corridor-level pressure globally, behind only the Tehran-Beirut arc and the Borno-Niger belt. Reuters reporting from mid-March describes Pakistan's military conducting operations targeting Afghan Taliban positions, while earlier reporting documents Pakistani concerns regarding militant reprisal attacks following strikes in Afghan territory. The cross-border dynamic is the central analytical challenge. Violence in this corridor is partly terrorism, partly insurgency, and partly conventional border conflict. Our systems cannot fully separate those categories in real time, which is why the terrorism-specific classification for South Asia is hybrid mixed environment, rather than the pure terrorism designation that SSA receives. But the practical risk to organizations operating in or near the Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier is acute, regardless of how the violence is classified. We assess with moderate confidence that South Asia will experience continued militant escalation pressure over the next 7 days, with a probability of approximately 60 to 75%. The decision support recommendation is prepare, with active review warranted for organizations with diplomatic, NGO, supply chain, or expatriate exposure in the corridor. Europe and Russia-Eurasia sit in the middle of the board this week, and both require the same analytical discipline, separating conflict from terrorism. Europe's numbers look alarming on the surface. Ukraine recorded 1,630 political violence events, and Russia adds another 449. Together, they dominate the theater's statistical picture. But the terrorism-specific classification for Europe is political violence with unclear attribution. Ukraine's extreme event count reflects active armed conflict with Russia, not a terrorism-dominant threat pattern. The most important European signal this week is not in the numbers. It is in the absence of a signal. No Western European city appears in the top global hotspot or surge rankings based on terrorism-specific indicators. London shows as the top European surge city, but the signal is moderate rather than high. The probability of terrorism-dominant escalation in Europe over the next 7 days is assessed at 35 to 45%. That is not negligible, because the historical pattern of low-warning lone actor attacks in European capitals means the possibility can never be dismissed, but it is not the lead story this week. Russia and Eurasia presents the most challenging analytical environment on the board because it carries the highest misinformation risk of any theater. The single origin narrative share is the highest globally, meaning a disproportionate volume of reporting comes from a narrow set of sources. State-linked amplification and recycled claims inflate media volume without adding independently confirmed intelligence. Terrorism-dominant escalation probability is assessed at 25 to 40%. Latin America shows a structural picture that continues to concern us, but a live picture that does not yet convert that concern into a terrorism-specific warning. Ecuador is the single most elevated country on the entire global board in our structural model, with an exceedance probability of 1.0, meaning the model estimates with near certainty that Ecuador's violence will exceed its historical threshold. Ecuador recorded 59 events against a threshold of 31.8. Colombia, Honduras, and Puerto Rico also register at elevated levels, but the critical qualification is that the violence driving these numbers is overwhelmingly criminal and public order in nature rather than terrorism attributable. The live signal layer for Latin America is the thinnest on the board, with a health score of 61 out of 100. This means our real-time visibility into current conditions is limited. The terrorism-specific classification is hybrid mixed environment, and the probability of terrorism-dominant escalation is assessed at 30 to 40%. East Asia-Pacific and North America round out the board at watch level. In East Asia-Pacific, the Philippines and Thailand carry the theater's historical terrorism burden, but neither is producing above baseline pressure in the current period. Myanmar, despite 110 events per week, is actually running below its own extreme historical norm. The terrorism-dominant escalation probability is assessed at 25 to 35%. North America has the second largest media corpus of any theater, but volume does not equal signal. Most of the content is diffuse, crime-oriented, or narrative-heavy, rather than terrorism-specific. The United States registers at an exceedance probability of only 0.31, Canada at 0.07. The terrorism dominant escalation probability is assessed at 20 to 30%. Now let me identify the 3 priority corridors and the surge cities that matter most for operational decision-making this week. The 3 highest pressure corridors are, in order, the Tehran-Beirut Eastern Mediterranean Arc, which is the core of the MENA conflict system, the Borno-Niger border belt in West Africa, which is the epicenter of jihadist operational tempo, and the Afghanistan-Pakistan corridor, which combines militant networks, cross-border conflict, and border security dynamics. The global surge cities showing the highest 72-hour acceleration are Maiduguri, which leads the entire world, followed by Tehran, Kabul, Tel Aviv, Ras Laffan, Islamabad, Ramat Gan, Riyadh, Baghdad, and London. If your organization has personnel or operations in any of these cities, the theater-level recommendations I provided should be applied at the city level as well. 4 countries reach our critical early warning tier this week, warranting immediate review: Iran, Lebanon, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. 4 more reach the elevated tier, warranting active preparation: Pakistan, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and Ecuador. And Colombia, Iraq, Israel, and Somalia sit at the guarded tier, warranting enhanced monitoring. Let me now present 4 alternative scenarios that could change the picture. Scenario A is conflict de-intensification in MENA, assessed at 15 to 25% probability. If the Iran-Israel-Lebanon system transitions into a more contained state-on-state exchange with reduced non-state actor involvement, MENA's terrorism-dominant risk could moderate. Under that scenario, SSA would become the undisputed lead theater globally. Scenario B is a security force overmatch in SSA, assessed at 10 to 20% probability. A concentrated military operation in northeastern Nigeria could temporarily suppress visible jihadist operational tempo without destroying the underlying threat infrastructure. Decision-makers should distinguish reduced visibility from reduced capability. Scenario C is Afghanistan-Pakistan bilateral deconfliction, assessed at 10 to 20% probability. A temporary communication channel between the 2 governments could reduce immediate cross-border incident pressure without resolving the underlying militant network problem. Scenario D is a discrete terrorist plot in Europe, assessed at 10 to 15% probability. Despite Europe's mixed category classification, a lone actor or networked attack could emerge with limited warning. The current evidence does not justify pushing the forecast higher, but historical patterns mean this scenario can never be dismissed. Let me close with the gaps in our knowledge, because what we do not know is as important as what we do. We cannot determine with sufficient precision whether several high-count conflict spikes in MENA will express primarily as terrorism, proxy action, or conventional conflict over the next 7 days. We lack sufficient insight into the regeneration capacity of jihadist networks in the Borno-Niger belt following security force operations. We can assess capability along the Afghanistan-Pakistan corridor, but lack sourcing on leadership intent within cross-border militant networks. And our methodology is strongest at identifying sustained, structured threat patterns and weakest at anticipating discrete lone actor events in theaters where the background signal is low. The key takeaway for this week is this: the Middle East war has reshaped the global threat map. MENA is at the highest level we have ever assessed, but the violence there is a hybrid of state conflict, proxy operations, and terrorism that cannot be cleanly separated. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the purest terrorism signal on the planet, with confirmed mass casualty attacks and the world's highest urban surge concentration in Maiduguri. South Asia is accelerating, driven by a Pakistan-Afghanistan corridor that combines terrorism, insurgency, and border conflict in a volatile mix. And the rest of the world, while lower on the terrorism-specific scale, continues to present operational risks that require calibrated attention. The full analytical product with complete sourcing, probability breakdowns, severity assessments, alternative scenarios, intelligence gaps, and corridor-level decision support recommendations is available to subscribers. If your organization has international operations and you need to know what this means for your specific exposure, visit veridiongroup.com/briefing to schedule a consultation with our analysts. I am Sloan Mercer with the Veridion Group. Stay informed, stay prepared. I will see you next week.